So, good morning, persons of quality. Actually, it is Sunday evening. This is your introduction to John Keats, and it's specifically designed for period two. Ultimately, it may carry over into period three. We may have to repeat this. It all depends. As you know, I've got a lot of family stuff going on, and I have to take my daughter somewhere at 9 o'clock in the morning. So, I'm going to be teaching semi-remotely for the next few days. Just so that you have an eyeball on that, if you're period three or period seven, this is more than likely a live presentation. I can guarantee that for period seven. So this is John Keats. This is the final British Romantic poet that we have. I planned 4 days on this. Then I plan a test. So I want to make sure that we have all of these things right in front of us. Here are my notes. Just making sure that we're all on the same page. So make sure you have your notes, make sure you have your spiffy anthology, and this way we can get started with the particular content for today. So some basic biographical and I think important information about John Keats. Again, go back to the idea that these poets, these British Romantic poets, I keep saying lived fast and died young. They feel things more intently and more purposefully than does the average person, which is why I think all of these experiences for them were so much more intense. So John Keats, for example, only lived 25 years, 1795 to 1821, yet his poetic achievement is gigantic. His writing career lasted a little more than 5 years, 1814 to 1820. But he wrote 3 absolutely fantastic odes. And those odes are Ode to a Nightingale, Ode on a Grecian Urn, and Ode on Melancholy. This presentation will have you look at To Autumn, and it will briefly introduce Ode on a Grecian Urn, which is one of our major takeaways. The second major ode we're going to look at is Ode to a Nightingale. So you want to make sure that you at least write those 2 titles down in your notes. Ode on a Grecian Urn and Ode to a Nightingale. So I think these are important. Most of his major poems were written between his 23rd and 24th years, and all of his poems were written by his 25th year. Intense explosion of creative energy, and then tragically he dies. Tuberculosis. So less the live fast, died young, and more the sort of melancholy just died young because he was a sickly poet the entire time. So I think these are incredibly important ideas. So when we talk about his genius was not generally perceived during his lifetime or immediately afterwards. Seems to make sense. When Keats was dying, for example, he expected his poetry to be forgotten. He was going to flame out. No one really would pay attention to the kinds of things that he talked about. And so as an epitaph, that sort of final commentary he makes, that idea that would go on his tombstone, it indicates, here lies one whose name was writ in water. This idea of the temporary nature of things. But the 19th century critics and writers certainly, and readers, did come to appreciate him, though for the most part. But again, we didn't get too much into his work. So things that you want to pay attention to as important ideas. For example, he was a sensual poet. So he was very much about his imagery and the sensory details that he uses. So authors and critics and readers focused on his vivid, concrete imagery, on his portrayal of the physical and the passionate. These are things that you should be writing down in your notes. His vivid, concrete imagery, to repeat. His portrayal of the physical and the passionate, to repeat again. On his immersion in the moment. a poet who is very much concerned not with the eternal, not with the next step, but concerned about what was going on in the here and now. Kind of looking at the perspective of things, especially as we're getting further into the research paper. One literary critic wrote that Keats had a mind constitutionally inept for abstract thinking. Really a valuable comment. He had a mind that was constitutionally inept. Not constitution as in a U.S. document, but your constitution is what makes you up. The blending of your mind and your ability to express your thoughts. So he was constitutionally, fundamentally inept with abstract thinking, which is why everything remains tangible and concrete. That separates Keats from Wordsworth and Coleridge, and I was going to say Wordsworth again, and from your Shelleys and your Byrons. So very significantly, I think that's something you want in your notes, especially as you look at the poems To Autumn, as you look at Ode to a Nightingale. Nightingale, there's no G in there. So I think these things are important. We know that in the 20th century, we got a better understanding of Keats's poetry as more critics looked at the ideas and developed the concepts. He was and is praised for his seriousness and thoughtfulness and how he ponders larger issues, for his dealings with difficult human conflicts and artistic issues. The mind of the artist is, I got to think about how I want to phrase this. The mind of the artist is often influenced by feelings that are more violent and more engaging than the average person. So I think this is kind of important. He had an impassioned pursuit for the mental truth of things. Keats advocated living the ripest, fullest experience that one is capable of. Let me rephrase that so you have it in your notes. Keats advocated living the ripest, fullest experience that one is capable of. He believed that what determines truth is experience. That what we go through determines how we perceive what truth is. Again, as I'm saying this, I'm saying, didn't we talk about this over and over and over again this semester? Especially as we're drawing this particular very dense unit to a close. Look again how it's about the concrete. It's about the experience and how that determines how we perceive things. I am, of course, thinking of William Blake as I'm reviewing these kinds of things. So I think that's going to be extraordinarily valuable to us as a circumstance and some ideas to attend to. So I think very important. So make sure that as you review this particular segment of the presentation, you get some context about Keats and you can compare him to Byron and Shelley and Coleridge and Wordsworth and to an extent to William Blake way at the beginning of this semester, way back at middle January. So as we progress further into this presentation, let's take a look at Keats and Romanticism. You should have seen a title slide that transitioned into this particular section. So we know that Keats belonged to the literary movement called Romanticism. We've got our characteristics of Romanticism, and perhaps you should make sure you have those right at your fingertips and in your notes. Romantic poets, because of their theories of literature and life, were drawn to lyric poetry. Again, we're 2 months into this. They even developed a new form of the ode. Remember, the ode is it typically is a sorrowful poem designed as a sort of remembrance of something. But the Romantics sort of redefine this, and I particularly put this with Keats because he writes a lot of these. So it was called the Romantic Meditative Ode. So somewhere in this reflection on imagery and feeling and suffering and sort of redemption, you had this meditative process. So a little bit of research I'm going to throw in here. So there's a literary critic, his name is Jack Stillinger. He describes the typical movement of the Romantic Ode in this manner. So perhaps jot these notes down in your material. So first of all, the poet who is unhappy with his real life, current circumstances, unhappy with the real world, escapes or attempts to escape that world into his sense of the ideal. So there is a movement from the reality, the concrete, to the ideal state. Oftentimes that's an emotional moment, it's an intellectual moment. So we go from the concrete to the emotional. We go from logic to emotion. There it is again. This is about the ideal, ideal. Disappointed in his mental flight, the poet. This is the sort of the movement, the second movement. So disappointed with his mental flight, he returns to the real world. So it is a unhappy with current circumstances, flee to the ideal, but then return back to that world of the logic, hopefully with some sort of greater understanding about what's going on. Usually, the poet returns because human beings cannot live in the ideal or because he has not found what he was seeking. We can't stay in the fairy tale world, and we can't often find this peace and this solution that we're looking for. But more important here, I think, is the idea that the experience changes the poet, gives him insight, gives him some sort of understanding of where he is in the real world, gives him a way to cope, gives him a way to sort of deal with the feelings and those kinds of things. His views, feelings at the end of the poem often differ significantly from those he held at the beginning. So it is transformative in its presentation. So this journey into the ideal is transformative for the poet. And as I just said that, I'm thinking, look at what happened in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. In the first book, 2 books, suffering, kills the albatross, suffers in the doldrums, all of this. Then he transcends into or moves into this sort of supernatural realm for the next book 3, 4, and 5, and then comes out the other side, presumably changed and more reflective. I think that's certainly going to be an interesting idea for us. So much so that I think you could pause right here to write that down. Usually, because he's disappointed in his mental flight, he returns because humans cannot live in the world of the ideal. But the experience changes his understanding of where he's at, what he feels emotionally, where he is as a character. So this changes his understanding. His views, feelings change at the end of the poem, and they differ significantly from those at the beginning. So that's Keats's view of Romanticism and how that works. So let's talk about themes in Keats's poetry, major themes, or themes in Keats's major poems. I wanted to put this together with a PowerPoint so you could see the slides, but alas, it's not working too well for me this evening. So we're going to do some dictating here so you have this in your notes. So we have another critic, and he noted that Keats's important poems are related to or grow directly out of inner conflict. So Keats's poems are directly related to inner conflict. So the sip of coffee there was for the power pause, so that you could write that down. Keats's poems form or come directly out of inner conflict. For example, Pain and Pleasure are intertwined in Ode to a Nightingale and Ode on a Grecian Urn. And since you're going to be covering both of those, I think that's an important idea for you to write down. So the idea about this interplay between pain and pleasure, happiness and suffering, and how it is portrayed in the poetry is an incredibly important idea. And then we see that love is intertwined with pain in Ode on a Grecian Urn. It's not to, it's on a Grecian Urn. So love is intertwined with pain in Ode on a Grecian Urn. And pleasure is intertwined with death in La Belle Dame Sans Merci. La Belle Dame Sans Merci. It's French. It's the beautiful woman without pity. So you've got 3 upcoming Keatsian poetries. We got 3 days to look at this, so it should make sense. So I think these are some important ideas. Another critic defines the paradox in Ode to a Nightingale. This critic says that the world of imagination offers a release from the painful world of actuality. Yet at the same time, it renders the world of actuality more painful by contrast. Again, really interesting idea, heady, intellectual. So I'm going to say this again just to make sure we have this in our notes. The critic's name is Cleanth Brooks. Defines the paradox that is the theme in Ode to a Nightingale. Ode to a Nightingale. As the world of imagination offers a release from the painful world of truth, of actuality. Important idea. Yet at the same time, it renders the world of truth more painful. What a very interesting concept to have you reflect on and think about as you move forward. There's several other themes in Keats' poetry as well. So a couple of these I think are important, and again, much more intellectual than some of the earlier Romantic poets. So we have the conflict between passion and art, between joy and melancholy. So again, between passion and art, and between joy and melancholy. We take a look at the ideal versus the real. Notice we keep talking about that over and over again as we go through this particular term. And we talk about being immersed in passion as well as desiring to escape it because it's too painful. We so want to be in it until it's crushing to us, and then we want to flee, but we often can't. Significantly the theme of La Belle Dame Sans Merci. So I think these are some very interesting ideas. And to go further with it, Keats often associated love and pain. Associating love and pain both in his own life and in his poetry. For example, he wrote of a young woman he found attractive. Okay? And he writes, when she comes into a room, she makes an impression the same as the beauty of a leopardess. I should like her to ruin me. That intense passion that we know is going to be horribly destructive. That sounds like romantic love. Passion driven by feeling, by feeling an intensity without that sense of time and slowing it down and the pitfalls of youth. No offense to any of you, but yeah, pitfalls of youth. So I think that's an interesting idea. So as I'm going through this, and we see the same ideas in the Eve of St. Agnes, which I don't think we're going to have time to cover it this year. We see it in La Belle Dame Sans Merci, which I've already said 3 times now, and I choke on the French. So it certainly is going to be something worth our time. So we think that's important. So love and pain and their association. There's a thematic idea. A second thematic idea is that of identity. And we've been continuing to talk about this concept of identity as we progress through all of this. Identity is an issue to Keats and for the dreamers in his odes. So the characters in his odes suffer from this same concept of identity. We see it in Ode to a Nightingale. We also see it in his narrative poems. And again, there's that French poem title that I'm just going to leave lingering out there. Keats says of the poetic character. I just want to make sure I got my notes here because it looked confusing for a second. Of the poetic character, Keats says, I just got to rephrase it. It is not itself, it has no self, it is everything and nothing. It has no character, it enjoys light and shade, it lives in gusto, but it lives in gusto, be it foul or fair, high or low, right or poor, mean or elevated. Remember, Keats is talking about the poetic voice, the poetic characters in his stories, what the hero possesses. Very much like the Byronic hero and how we address that, this is a significant idea. How Keats perceives and sees all these things. So I think very important, significant ideas for us overall. And I think, in truth, and the last comment I have here in my notes says that Keats calls the poet a chameleon. Ponder that. Think about it for a little bit and see what kinds of ideas that makes you think about as you progress through your material. So this segment is specifically about Keats's odes, Ode to a Nightingale, and Ode on a Grecian Urn. Now, there's a third, Ode to Melancholy, but we're not going to have time to cover that one this year. So Ode to a Nightingale and Ode on a Grecian Urn. So what we know about these, and research says, is that these poems grew out of, now this is going to be a quote, I'm going to pull segments from it. It grew out of a persistent kind of experience which dominated Keats's feelings, attitudes, and thoughts during this particular time. So it's all based on a feeling that unifies these three specific odes. Each of them is a unique experience, of course, unique content. But each of them is also, as it were, a facet of a larger experience. It's a segment of something much bigger. This larger experience is an intense awareness of both the joy and pain. There's that dichotomy, that paradox again. The joy and pain, the happiness and the sorrow of human life. This awareness is feeling and becomes also thought, a kind of brooding as the poet sees them in others and feels them in himself. So important, I'm going to say that one more time. This larger experience is an intense awareness of both the joy and the pain, the happiness and the sorrow of human life. This awareness is feeling and becomes also thought, a brooding, B-R-O-O-D-I-N-G, a brooding as the poet sees these feelings in others and feels them in himself. End quote. Just so we're specific about that. I think there's some very significant ideas going on there. So in Ode to a Nightingale and Ode on a Grecian Urn, which we're going to cover both, Keats tries to free himself from the world of change. Remember how we talked about change as a significant idea in this poetry? He wants to free himself from the world of change by identifying with that which he's describing. The bird in the first, and then the Grecian urn, and the frozen paintings in Ode on a Grecian Urn. So I think these are specific ideas that we want to be able to go through and talk about as we cover these poems. So I'm going to find that to be extraordinarily significant. When we talk about Keats's imagery and the way he develops his poems, his imagery ranges among all our physical sensations. Again, your five senses, your tangible kinds of things, your sight, your hearing, your taste, your touch, smell, temperature, weight, pressure, hunger, thirst, and movement. All these feelings can and often are addressed in Keats's poetry. Keats repeatedly combines different images or different senses in one image. He attributes the trait of one sense to another. Say it again so you can write it down. You also have the power to pause to make sure you can take the notes. So, Keats repeatedly combines different senses in one image. He attributes the traits of one sense to another, a practice called synesthesia. I just wanted to make that geeky statement here. So, synesthesia, S-Y-N-A-E-S-T-H-E-S-I-A. Again, S-Y-N-A-E-S-T-H-E-S-I-A. One more time, just in case you missed it the first two. Synesthesia, S-Y-N-A-E-S-T-H-E-S-I-A. Keats's synesthetic, there's your adjective form, imagery performs two major functions. His synesthetic imagery performs two major functions. One, it is part of their sensual effect. What we feel when we see those images, hear them, those kinds of things. It is also the combining of senses normally experienced as separate. It suggests an underlying unity of dissimilar happenings. Again, one of those geeky things I want you to just write down, and we'll talk about it as we go through the Keatsian poetry. The oneness of all forms of life. Richard Fogel, another researcher, calls these images the product of Keats's unrivaled ability to absorb, sympathize with, and humanize natural objects. Of all that synesthesia stuff, that last statement seems to make the biggest impact on me. Richard Fogel, a researcher, calls these images, the way that Keats puts these things together, he calls them the product of Keats's unrivaled ability to absorb, sympathize with, and humanize natural objects. I think this is all the really good background that you're going to need to understand the things that we continue to work on here in this, although not ideal sort of circumstance with my family issues out, but I think certainly this is going to work in your favor. Now, this is designed primarily for period 2 because I'm not there, but everybody would benefit from watching this. I'm going to insert this into PlayPosit simply to make sure that you're watching and you're taking the notes. It takes really the place of a full class period. So I think really we're going to be moving ourselves forward with the John Keats material. Now, ultimately, this plan is Monday, Tuesday. I'll clearly be back on Wednesday. Tentatively, we'll see where we're at with Thursday and Friday. It all depends on circumstances outside of my control. So this is our introduction and general coverage of the material of John Keats. Make sure you've taken notes. When you are finished with your notes, take a picture and email them to me. You can Adobe scan them, I don't care, but I want to see where your notes are. They will count for the class participation credit from Monday. All right, guys, be well, be safe, and read carefully.